Now, as we mentioned today, there is this upcoming RevCon that will happen in April and May next year. And given the many crises that we're facing today, I think it is only relevant to look back and to consider the experience we've had and the lessons we drew back in 1995. It's been almost 25 years ago, and that's when the treaty was extended indefinitely. And I'm extremely happy to have this opportunity to discuss that conference with immediate participants of that conference. But to begin with, let me introduce my co-chair. In fact, we use a new format. We co-chair some of our sessions. And it is my pleasure to have ELN as both our partners and one of the co-founder of the ELN and deputy director, Shatabisha SHETTY, kindly agreed to co-chair this session. So it's over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Shatabisha SHETTY. I'm the deputy director and co-founder of the European Leadership Network. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this session on the 1995 NPT Review and Extension Conference, Lessons for Today. Who better to help us examine and assess these lessons than the distinguished panelists here, all of whom were instrumental in the important diplomacy ahead of and during the 1995 conference. While they all have illustrious careers, for brevity, I will highlight their roles leading up to and during the 1995 conference. First, I'd like to introduce Ambassador Grigory Berdennikov. Following his tenure as Deputy Foreign Minister, Ambassador Berdennikov was the Russian ambassador to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. We're also fortunate to be joined by Ambassador Peggy Mason. Ambassador Mason was the Canadian ambassador to the CD from 1989 until 1995 and led Canada's PrepCom delegations in 93 and 94. We're also joined by former Foreign Minister Nabil FAHMI, who at the time was political advisor to then Foreign Minister Moussa. Minister FAHMI was also the chair of the Egyptian delegation to the Arms Control and Regional Security, or ACRS, working group, which was convened from 1992 to 95. And last but not least, we have Ambassador Bob Einhorn, who was a US Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs at the time, as well as chair of the US delegation to the ACRS working group, which was co-chaired by the US and Russia. The 1995 Review and Extension Conference is a major milestone in the NPT's history. 25 years after the NPT entered into force, states parties would decide whether to continue with the treaty in one of three ways: indefinitely, continued in a fixed period, or a number of periods. During the preparatory stages of the 95 conference, there were deep divisions among states parties regarding the review process and extension decision. Russia, the United States, and many Western countries decided early on that it was in their interest and that of the global community to extend the treaty indefinitely. However, not all states were convinced. Some felt that in order to have leverage, a rolling period of 25 years would be better, so that the nuclear weapon states would have to answer on to whether they had fulfilled their Article 6 obligations. Eventually, however, an overwhelming majority expressed strong support for indefinite extension of the treaty. This culminated in a package deal of three decisions: to strengthen the review process, establish principles and objectives to measure the implementation of the obligations under the treaty, and a statement on the indefinite extension. The final key component of the package deal was the resolution on the Middle East, which endorsed the creation of the Middle Eastern zone free of nuclear weapons, as well as other weapons of mass destruction, including their delivery systems. The NPT's indefinite extension would not have been possible without addressing this issue. Moreover, efforts including the agreement over the completion of negotiations on a comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty no later than 1996, the commencement and early conclusion of negotiations on a fissile material cut-off treaty, and a firm commitment by the nuclear weapon states to go beyond reductions envisaged in the START II treaty were all strongly endorsed. So what can we learn from this experience that could be applied today? For the answers, I'll turn to our 4 excellent speakers to provide their insights to the successes and lessons learned from the 95 conference. Anton and I will begin with some prepared questions before moving on to a Q&A. The first question, which I will pose to all the panelists in the order presented in the program, so Ambassador Berdennikov first. Going into the 95 review conference, what were your country's positions on the treaty's extension? For how long and why? And how did we arrive at the indefinite extension as opposed to other options? Ambassador.
Well, the answer to the first question is very simple. We were for indefinite extension because it is longer. How we arrived, we listened to what people are saying in the general debate. We took into account the meetings that we had before the conference with many delegations. Then we made a count and found that there is a very good chance to have a majority, and the treaty provides for majority rule by Article 10 of the treaty. And we were very grateful to the Canadian delegation who took upon itself the burden of presenting the draft resolution or decision for indefinite extension and started gathering co-sponsors. And when, as we expected, the number of co-sponsors became higher than needed for majority, we knew that the deal is done. And then the question was whether we should really put it to a vote or there could be a more benign solution, though again based on this majority as required by the treaty. And we found that we can even have a consensus provided P&Os, the extended review process, and Middle East resolution. And all 3 of them were acceptable to us, so we were happy to have the consensus. We do not consider it sort of legal package. We consider it negotiating package, meaning that if one delegation thinks that, well, something is wrong with implementation of one part of the package, the whole package doesn't fall. And the only legal binding resolution or decision that was taken at the extension conference was exactly the decision on extension. The other were optional and, well, not legal binding. Well, what else? What are the lessons? Well, at least for me, the main lesson is that if we can work on the basis of, well, common positions with major countries, everything is possible, including the solution of very difficult issues. Because in my view, the decision of 95 actually saved the treaty. Because if it were, say, 25 years extension, can you imagine what will happen next year? I really doubt that the treaty would survive 2020. So, well, this is how I see it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ambassador Einhorn?
Well, like Russia, the United States decided well in advance of the '95 conference that we wanted the indefinite extension of the NPT. Why? Because we believe that making the NPT permanent would contribute to its stability and its predictability. Various other delegations talked about finite extensions, 15 years, 20 years, 25 years. We were concerned that some states, some non-nuclear weapon states, would decide to begin hedging their nuclear bets, would decide to keep their future nuclear weapons options open if they feared that at the end of a fixed duration, some of their neighbors might decide to pursue nuclear weapons. And we thought it would be better to avoid these kinds of fears about the future and make the treaty permanent. The lesson learned, I think the lesson we learned was that despite very strong differences among the parties on certain issues like disarmament, there was nonetheless a near universal recognition that the NPT served the security interests of all NPT parties, and that pursuing tactics of brinksmanship that could undermine the value of the treaty ought to be avoided. I think that was an important lesson from '95.
Thank you. Ambassador Mason?
Thank you very much. I feel at the outset, I feel like a tiny bit of an imposter on two grounds. I was never ambassador to the CD. Canada, it's amazing. People think I was there, but we had a very unique situation at the time, and I was actually a roving ambassador based in Ottawa to deal with policy. I went to New York for the first committee in the Disarmament Commission, and I went to Geneva often for the treaty reviews, but I was never actually in Geneva. And at the CD, I mean. And also, of course, I was very involved in the preparatory work and both in the formal NPT PrepCom process, but also in the informal negotiations in the lead up to the conference. But my term ended at the end of December 1994, and therefore it was Ambassador Chris Westall who led the Canadian effort for the actual review conference. In terms of there's a theme here, in terms of how Canada arrived at the indefinite extension, I mean, it was our position from the start. There was no other option seriously considered, and given the judgment that as to the importance of the NPT to Canadian and international peace and security. And then on the question of how did we, the conference, how did we, the states parties, arrive at the decision on indefinite extension? It's interesting, well, there was Ambassador Berdennikov did mention diplomacy a little bit, but certainly diplomacy, both hard, some would say too hard, and soft diplomacy, I would say very creative diplomacy, in support of indefinite extension, played an extremely important role in the outcome. The starting point, as everyone has reflected from their own position, was that a majority of states believed that indefinite extension was in their security interests. At the same time, they also wanted new, meaningful commitments from the nuclear weapon states in relation to the Article 6 disarmament obligations. And so this is where the creative cross-group middle power diplomacy led by Canada and South Africa was so important. I want to say a word, though, about the rolling 25-year automatic renewal option, unless a majority opposed it. That might have been attractive to a broad group. because it would have meant retaining an element of leverage over the nuclear weapon states in relation to the implementation of steps under Article 6. And I have to say that when Ambassador Berdennikov makes reference to the legally versus the politically binding, those were exactly some of the reasons why states wished, wanted to perhaps retain some leverage. But in any event, that option, which might have attained broad support, was never the subject of a serious, sustained diplomatic effort across groups, which the indefinite extension was, basically because the non-aligned movement, for a variety of reasons, which my colleague Nabil FAHMI may touch on, never came to a unified position on what type of rolling option might be proposed. And therefore, it never was the subject of, as I said, sustained diplomacy. Now, in terms of the lesson, to me, the overriding lesson is diplomacy matters, but leverage really, really helps if the will of the majority of non-nuclear weapon states, not just the nuclear weapon states, is to be taken into account. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister FAHMI?
Well, thank you. Let me start by saying that Egypt signed the NPT the very first day it was open for signature. It did not, however, ratify it until 1981. And the specific reason being, for us, like for everybody else, it is a security treaty meant to enhance our security, and there was an imbalance in our region because Israel refused to ratify at that point. And we said from day one, the minute they join the NPT, we will join it as well. We joined it even they didn't later on. I make that point to explain what I'm going to say now. Anybody going into the NPT conference, and frankly everybody out of it, wanted the NPT to be extended. It didn't serve anybody's purpose. Even those outside, they were quite happy without the obligations, and that we were taking them on ourselves. So it was never an issue of, does anybody oppose the extension or not, although the treaty isn't perfect, but that wasn't on the tape. The debate was how long and in what format. Our position as Egypt was 25 years revolving was the better option, because exactly the point that Peggy made, although she wasn't necessarily defending that, it provided leverage to push the three pillars of the process, the nuclear disarmament part, the proliferation part, and the peaceful use part. It also provided leverage to get an asymmetry in obligations on a regional basis later. Now, having said that, for us, we went into the conference knowing it was going to be extended indefinitely. The reason being, exactly what you said, Peggy, the non-aligned meeting before the conference didn't reach a conclusion on the extension, specifically because South Africa, with all due respect to their positions, decided not to support indefinite extension. That really broke the ranks from indefinite, from 25 revolving possibly, to the issue of indefinite. The debate then at the conference wasn't actually about indefinite or not. It was about with a vote or not.
Yes.
And I would argue very strongly, if you want to get into a legalistic determination of what decisions were taken, I would caution you. The NPT itself, indefinitely extended, includes provisions for withdrawal. So even as it is now a legally binding document, if countries decide that their security is threatened, they can withdraw legally according to the treaty. So more importantly, let's focus on the political components and how to move forward. The lessons drawn for us is that we have the same objective. We need to work together, but you need to keep leverage in your pocket because this is a process. The NPT was never meant to be born still. It was meant to be a process that continues thereon. If we had to decide again, let me just make one point first. In the process of putting together the three elements of the agreement, I talked to Janta Dinapala at the time. He came to me with the draft resolution on extension. And he said, how far can you go? And I said, frankly, if you write something that's truthful, I won't ask for a vote. But if you claim it's more than what it is, I will personally ask for a vote, and we will vote no. on the issue of indefinite. So he used the language, widespread majority, which was truthful. Didn't like it, but it was truthful. Therefore, we did not ask for a vote on that. If I was to revisit the process again, I would probably do it exactly the same way. We took, probably a bit more seriously, that the three depositories, when they sponsored the Middle East resolution, were committed to implementing it. And I think I took it more seriously than they did, if I may say. But I would have asked them then to put more of a timeline in the process. But at the end of the day, destroying the NPT does not serve anybody's purpose. We need to pursue nuclear disarmament and nuclear non-proliferation as a collective project.
I think all four panelists agreed that it was a huge success, the NPT Review and Extension Conference in 1995. So I would like to ask the following question. What were the three major factors which make this success possible? Because we will discuss NPT Review 2020 very soon, and I would like to ask all four of you what were the factors, how you see them, three major factors. And I propose you to answer probably in reverse order. Ambassador FAHMI, would you like to start?
Sure. I wouldn't qualify it as a huge success because for me, the conference is less important than the NPT regime and what is built on it. For us, the NPT regime is the core of the universal non-proliferation regime. If I was to say it was a huge success, I'd have to look at the 25 years afterwards. Is the nuclear disarmament program, is the non-proliferation program, are we better off now as a result of the conference over the last 25 years? I would argue no, we're not. I'm not going to put all the blame on the conference itself, because it's a point in time. But I actually think it was a success in preserving the NPT as the core of the regime. It was not a success in putting together an action plan to build on the three components that are part of the NPT. And for us, frankly, it was a serious disappointment in that the resolution on the Middle East has not been implemented since then.
Ambassador Mason.
I mean, there'll be some repetition here from what we've already said, but I think it bears repetition. I mean, I think the first factor, which all of us has mentioned, was the overriding conviction that indefinite extension was in the security interests of the states concerned. I mean, no outcome was not an option. Also, of course, very relevant, very facilitative, was the geopolitical context, particularly significant progress in nuclear arms reductions between the United States and Russia. And at the time, progress towards a comprehensive test ban treaty and an agreed mandate for the fissile material cutoff treaty. Of course, we haven't got beyond that mandate, but those were positive signs at the time. But, and this is going to, of course, become my broken record, the key factor was sustained, creative, multilateral diplomacy across regional and political groups, first in support of an indefinite extension without a vote led by Canada, but this was in the context of the South African-led diplomatic effort to really secure a meaningful agreement on principles and objectives for the implementation of the treaty, and of course, particularly Article 6. To respond to the very strong majority desire for meaningful commitments in relation to Article 6. And then, of course, in addition, the Canadian effort on a strengthened review process. And all of that was aided and facilitated by very fair and balanced consultations by a very experienced president of the conference, Jayantha Dhanapala. And all of that then was in the context of a desire by all sides to reach agreement and therefore to negotiate in good faith. And that, of course, if we bring it forward to today, is the startling, the problem. Is there, lots of rote statements being made by all sides, but where is the commitment to real negotiation or even the capacity for real negotiations? And I'll come back to that actually at, later, in one of the later questions.
Thank you.
So three factors contributing to success. One, as Peggy mentioned, it was the shared interest of NPT parties in having a strong and durable NPT. A second, and this is largely from a U.S. perspective, I think a contributing factor was the high-level attention given in the U.S. government, and not exclusively U.S. government, several governments, high-level attention to ensuring the success. I'll mention a couple of things. Warren Christopher, who was our Secretary of State at the time, sent a personal instruction to all U.S. ambassadors. And the instruction was go in and see the foreign minister of the host government and encourage indefinite extension. Another factor, President Bill Clinton got personally involved. He made phone calls. Nabil will remember a phone call between Bill Clinton and President Mubarak. So there was never before 95, never after 95 was such high-level attention given to this, and because of the perceived stakes. A third factor, the international environment was just very, very favorable. Peggy mentioned a number. I've jotted down a few things. START and INF were in force and being implemented effectively. The ABM Treaty was still in force at that time. The agreed framework with North Korea in '94, a year before. The Gulf War, a few years earlier, had ended Saddam's WMD programs. China had recently joined the NPT. South Africa had decided to give up its nuclear weapons and join as a non-nuclear weapon state. The CTBT was nearing completion. The Madrid peace process was still alive and hopeful. Iran's program had not gotten much publicity at that stage, was not really an issue. U.S.-Russian relations were in pretty good shape at that time. All of these factors contributed to what I think was non-proliferation optimism. It may have been the high water mark in the last 50 years for non-proliferation optimism. And in that environment, I think it was much easier for NPT parties to go along with indefinite extension.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Three factors. First, right environment. First of all, CTBT negotiations were, underway earnestly and for everyone to see. Second, we had just concluded START 2. FMCT was considered by everyone as the next step that would follow CTBT. And the mandate was already there. So the environment was really very optimistic at that time. Then I would say that there was unanimity and firmness about purpose. People really considered that it's better to have the indefinite extension instead of having this, uncertainty about, periodic or just one extension. And then the flexibility on means. As I said, it was possible to have the vote on just the indefinite extension and disperse. But people in earnest negotiated the other three parts, which was very important to uphold this optimistic environment. So, those were the three elements, in my opinion.
Will you follow?
Yeah, so now I will ask an individual question to each of the panelists before Anton will open it up to the floor. Ambassador Mason, I'll mix it up. At the 1995 RevCon, Ambassador Nabil pulled together a president's consultation involving 25 of the principal players. This was instrumental in crafting the language for the package of extension decisions. The key players that took the lead in providing ideas for consensus were Canada and South Africa. In this regard, Canada convened and chaired 3 cross-regional and issue-based groupings to secure a majority in favor of indefinite extension. These were the Mason Group, the Cosmopolitan Core Group, and the co-sponsors List Management Group. The group named after you is one of the many indications that Canada played an instrumental role at the 95 RevCon. Do you think the 1995 presidential consultations experience is applicable to the upcoming 2020 RevCon?
Well, sadly, the short answer is no. And why? This question, the question itself, of course, underscores the point that I've been making about the importance of creative, good faith, cross-group diplomacy in the success of the 1995 conference. But the experience of the 2000 review conference, which also saw a substantive outcome with respect to Article 6 obligations, and actually reaffirmed the commitment to the ABM Treaty, among other things, really showed the limitations of small group presidential consultations outside the context of the indefinite extension. To put it bluntly, once the overriding common aim of indefinite extension is removed, such small group consultations, however well managed, shield, not expose, the nuclear weapon states to the pressure of the overwhelming majority. In 2000, the presidential consultations were seen as hijacking the broader review process and were rejected by the majority, who refused to be excluded. This led to negotiations in the big room, as a Canadian colleague of mine put it, where real compromises were made. Now, this is not to say that separate consultations on select issues are not helpful, but they must be open-ended so that all who want to participate can do so. The point is, in this current context that we're in, you need pressure from the many, but you also need the capacity of delegations to negotiate in real time and not just read prepared statements. I reference that, of course, because all of those have had to live through the stultifying efforts of the CD prepared statements and lack of negotiation. Over time it takes its toll in terms of ability to really negotiate. Of course, we've also got the added complication in the context of the 2020 review conference that there isn't as yet a president. But the key point, I would say, is really that the nuclear weapon states have to, can't be let off the hook and really have to feel the pressure coming from the many for the failure to live up to the 1995 Article 6 commitments, and not just 95, but 2000. I mean, the ABM Treaty, when I mentioned in particularly striking. Sort of a year before the unilateral abrogation of it, there's a reconfirmation of it in a treaty that's considered to be the cornerstone of international security. And that also harkens back to my colleague Nabil FAHMI's point about withdrawal. These treaties all have withdrawal provisions. So, indefinite extension, is strong, but it's not the whole answer.
Thank you. Ambassador Berdennikov, in the run-up to the 1995 review conference, there was close contact between the P5 with an agreement to push for indefinite extension. Russia, along with the other P5, lobbied other countries in favor of indefinite extension. There were regular meetings during the RevCon between the P5 to discuss tactics. And remembering your experience of P5 cooperation or coordination during that period, can the same effort be applied again for the 2020 review conference?
Well, before 95, we had a very well established P5 process, not only for NPT purposes, but also, and maybe foremost, for the CTBT negotiations. We were meeting in the P5 format 2 times a week. So we knew each other very well, and this was a very familiar forum to discuss things. And it was actually continued in New York for NPT purposes. Well, you understand that now the situation is a little bit difficult from that point of view, and different, I would say. So, well, we are, of course, open for such cooperation if others are. Well, but I think this time it is really important to have a constructive approach to the conference in New York next spring, as my minister just said, regardless of what mechanisms would be employed this time, bearing in mind the situation we are in. Thank you.
Minister FAHMI, in 1995, the effort to get widespread majority during their negotiations were closely tied to there being consensus on the Middle East. Can you elaborate on whether the 95 approach could be applied again?
Sure. First of all, everything my colleagues here said, even if there's a little bit of a nuance, they basically emphasized 2 points. The importance of diplomacy. We were all engaged in serious diplomacy with each other, even when we differed. We had a lot of differences, but we went back to each other. And the reason we did is we all understood it was in our collective interest to get a deal that deals with each other's concerns as much as we could. Nobody was being dramatic or emotional. It was serious negotiations. That's the first missing component here. Trying to engage the concerns of others is missing now, over and above the general disarmament environment, which is much worse than what it was there. But that being said, if there is a commitment to diplomacy, I actually still believe the NPT, with all of its weaknesses, is better to build on rather than to destroy. And I would even add another point, because it's my nature to be provocative. I'd love the conference to succeed, but I won't lose sleep if it doesn't. I will lose sleep if we destroy the non-proliferation objectives that we have all come to. And that's done in and outside the NPT.
Ambassador Einhorn, you and Minister FAHMI were the chairs of your respective national ACRS delegations, and you were the US co-chair of the working group. From your perspective from the US, could the early 90s approach on structuring the discussions on the Middle East be applied to next year's review conference?
We're in a very different environment today. I don't believe the consensus on the Middle East zone that we had in '95 could be repeated today. In '95, you had a good faith effort by many delegations to work out a resolution. And I give a lot of the credit, if not most of the credit, to Nabil FAHMI for that. This was a solution that every state in the region could support. Some not with enthusiasm, but could go along with it. And that was a promising beginning. But over the years, that situation has deteriorated. The security environment in the Middle East obviously has deteriorated significantly. And on the Middle East zone idea itself, the situation has degenerated into finger-pointing and the scoring of political points. And I think it's kind of lost its way. I understand the frustration, I understand the reasons for it, but we're not in the same situation today. Today we have a process, and I'm thinking of the UN-organized conference that will be held later this month on the Middle East zone. We have a conference that we have a process that does not seem intended to bring everybody in the region on board. And I think that's unfortunate. I think there are practical steps that could be taken to advance the idea of a Middle East zone free of all weapons of mass destruction. Francesca mentioned one of them as a question in the last session, a Middle East zone free of all nuclear weapon tests. Patricia talked about the use of chemical weapons in the region. What about an agreement creating a Middle East zone free of all chemical weapons? Several of the countries of the region are now thinking of pursuing nuclear power programs. Why not some kind of regional cooperation in the civil uses of nuclear energy? All of these kinds of steps would be practical, I think doable, and could involve major progress toward a full-up zone. But I see little interest in that among the regional parties. And as long as the regional parties and some outside powers pursue an all-or-nothing approach toward the zone, I think the result is going to be nothing.
I think it was very useful discussion, though it made me even less optimistic about 2020 NPT review conference, because we have nothing from the list which was mentioned, except probably that most of countries hopefully still share the importance of NPT regime. But there are a few other people in the room who were in New York in 1995, who took part in the conference in different capacities. So you, as well as, of course, other participants, are welcome to make your comments, your questions. Bill, Potter, and Tariq Rauf are the first two. Bill, please. And Pyotr Tapechkanov next.
Thank you very much. Bill Potter at the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies in Monterey. Indeed, 95 was my first conference, but my question actually pertains to something that preceded 1995, which hasn't been mentioned. I mean, a number of you have talked about the consultations among the P5, other regional consultations. But since this is a meeting organized by an NGO, I'm going to try my best to be optimistic. I'll take a different stance at the next session. But at this session, I'd be interested if the panelists might reflect on the role played by an NGO, the PPNN, the Program for Promoting Nuclear Non-Proliferation, which many years in advance of 95 brought together both diplomats and experts to address issues that they anticipated would arise at the review conference. Ambassador Denapala, in fact, was part of that group. The Russians, the Americans, the Egyptians, the Canadians, and a number of other key countries, South Africa, participated. Is it conceivable that that kind of an approach today, not looking to 2020, but let's say optimistically looking at 2025, could such an approach perhaps facilitate the kind of bridge building and anticipation of crucial issues that I think contributed in part to the success of 1995?
So let's collect 3 more questions. Tariq Rauf next.
Thank you, Anton. Tariq Rauf was a member of the Canadian delegation in 1995. I wanted to ask a question to Ambassador Berdennikov and then a couple of comments to the rest of them. Ambassador Berdennikov, it's very rarely that I find myself in disagreement with you, but today is unfortunately one of those times. But before that, I just wanted to remind you that you were the person who actually came up with the idea of having those countries that supported indefinite extension put it in writing in this list management core group. And it was my duty to collect these 111 signatures, which I presented to you and your colleagues, which allowed this formulation that Nabil mentioned, which Dhanapala used, that since the majority exists, we can have indefinite extension. But my point of departure is that if you look at the record, And the way in which Dhanapala presented the extension decision rested on the foundation of Decision 1 on the strengthened review process, Decision 2 on principles and objectives, and then it had sort of a roof of the Middle East resolution that came after. So if we strip it away and say only the extension decision is legally binding and the rest of the package is not, is very problematic, because then the non-weapon states can say, well, fine, we disregard the extension package because, as you heard from some of your colleagues, in their view and in the view of me and others, many of those commitments made when they were implemented, and you will recall your colleague Michael Weston, the same afternoon that indefinite extension was agreed, the weapon states walked away from many of the things that they had agreed in the morning to be put in the review part. So the weapon states have adopted a transactional attitude, and here I want to address Nabil. So from the Arab states, the Arabs were given the Middle East resolution in 1995, so that bought your support. In 2000, you got the naming of Israel, another transaction. 2005, nothing happened. 2010, you got the commitment to the 2012 conference, which never happened. And so now, are you going to make another deal? And this conference on the UN General Assembly, one of the co-sponsors of the Middle East resolution and a depository of the NPT, the US has said this decision of the General Assembly is illegitimate. So what kind of a rules-based world are we living in when a permanent member of the Security Council calls the decision of the General Assembly, which is taken legitimately, as illegitimate? So which world are we heading to? And perhaps Bob might have something to say on this as well. And
Tarek, I think
finally,
1 second.
Yeah. The same goes for nuclear disarmament. We had principles and objectives, 13 steps, and the action plan, and now in 2020, I see another way of buying off the weapon states to get success. Thank you.
Piotr Topechkanov next, and after that we will take the fourth question and give the floor to panelists to respond.
Piotr Topechkanov, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. As Mr. Einhorn argued, the indefinite extension of the NPT stopped the possibility for non-nuclear weapon states to decide on the creation of nuclear weapons at the end of the NPT term, if it's not indefinitely extended. However, as Ambassador FAHMI noted, the possibility remained in the treaty, Article 10. Openly speaking, the NPT didn't cement the non-nuclear status of non-nuclear states. They may withdraw, and it already happened to one country that signed and ratified the NPT. At the same time, as argued by nuclear ban proponents, it cemented the nuclear status of P5. This contradiction is more and more visible in the context of the arms control crisis and challenging for the NPT regime, and already resulted in some moves and initiatives such as TPNW. What is your vision how to deal with this contradiction in the NPT context? How to prevent this contradiction negative impact on the future of the treaty and the regime built on that? Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was a question over there from the lady who sits next to Dr. Kirichenko, So, do you have a question? Yes. Please.
Ksenia Bernavskaya, MEF University and CTBDO Youth Group. So I have a question in concern with one of the pillars of NPT, which is disarmament. In regards with Article 6, which stipulates states' commitment to take measures toward nuclear disarmament, do you consider the initiative which was proposed by United States in May to create a working group which works on the environment for disarmament any effective and promising initiative, or you consider it as a step back in terms of process of disarmament? Thank you.
Yeah, this good question. I suggest that we will discuss it during the next panel because it will be focused on nowadays and upcoming 2020 NPT review conference. But now all four panelists have time to react. Ambassador Berdennikov, would you be the first one?
Well, can I?
Yes, please, please. Go ahead.
On PPNN role, I consider it to be a major contribution to the success of 95, and well, in general, it was a wonderful wonderful organization and very useful for the purposes of NPT reviews, not only in 95. We had sort of, you know, dress rehearsals for review conferences. And the people who worked for PPNN were very dedicated to NPT, and actually it was the hand of Ben Sanders, actually, who wrote the decision on indefinite extension himself. Well, so I just am very sorry that due to lack of funds, they had to cease their operations. Well, I hope that something of the sort could be resurrected in future. Well, Tariq, thank you very much for your effort at the 95 conference. Without you, I think we would have a much worse situation now, maybe even at the end of existence of the treaty. Well, I do not think it is worthwhile to argue what is legal, what is not. I know that the treaty provides for an extension decision in Article 10. What is, well, additional to that comes under Article 8, and not in the form of, well, something that was actually done at the extension conference, not in P&O and extended review process. So it was somewhat creative thinking what was in it, but it led to a good result of having a consensus decision which everyone could support, and we are very glad that it happened that way. Thank you very much.
Bob.
An NGO role in bridge building, I'm not optimistic about that, Bill. The positions are so dug in at this point that I don't see a real role. Maybe the NGO community can come up with some clever ways of navigating around those differences toward a successful conference, and I have some views of my own about that. But bridge building is going to be hard today. On the legitimacy of the UNGA decision to hold this conference, of course it's legitimate to do that. It's, you know, the UNGA can do that. Whether it's wise is something else. Whether it's going to lead to a dead end is, you know, in my view, the more important question. And I do believe it's likely to lead to a dead end. On the CEND, you mentioned, we'll talk about that later.
As part of, go ahead.
And I'm terribly sorry. The amplification made it very difficult for me to get your point. Maybe we can discuss that later. Sorry.
Mr. Mason.
I just, I want to clarify a point with respect to, yes, the option is there for any member of the NPT to leave, but I do want to recall, and you know, talking about international law, and that's a term I do much prefer to this very opaque rules-based international order. But that is that in 1992, there was the first ever summit-level meeting of the UN Security Council, and it declared that, it decided that horizontal proliferation of nuclear weapons was a threat to international peace and security. So actually, the leave is, so while technically non-nuclear weapon states are free to leave the treaty, in effect, they would then transgress against that decision of the UN Security Council, and then, of course, be subject under the powers of the Security Council to action. I certainly think that something like the PPND is very useful for trying to, and having, of course, governments participate, far better than the government leading. I mean, as with respect to the American initiative, a kind of academic discussion. I think the track 2 can really play a role. But I want to come back just briefly to something that there was, I know in the interest of time, we didn't get to one question, but it was something I was going to say, and without saying it, it sounds unduly negative, and no suggestions for what's coming up in 2020. One of the, I've talked about how important cross-group diplomacy can be for bridge building, and of course the role of Canada in that regard. And one of the problems we've got today, but it's a fixable problem, it's very difficult, but it's fixable, we've got today is that one of those bridge builders, Canada, is now caucusing within the NPT in a NATO caucus. I can tell you when I was ambassador and head of DEL, that would have been anathema. That would have been unheard of. And that has turned this group of potential bridge builders from being creative advocates for building those bridges to apologists for the NATO nuclear weapon states. And lest I sound completely radical, that concern has led to a unanimous decision of the Canadian House of Commons National Defence Committee calling on Canada to begin an urgent discussion within NATO with a view to concrete action on an urgent basis to advance the stated NATO goal of creating the conditions for a world free of nuclear weapons. Now, if Canada took that up and even initiated that dialogue, then you'd have some concrete demonstration by a state sheltering under the nuclear umbrella that they really don't want this to remain forever and that they want to take concrete steps. And that starts to build an atmosphere where creative diplomacy can take hold.
Minister FAHMI.
Thank you. The major powers for generations now have been talking to us about deterrence and a balance of power to justify their policies. Then they're angry when we agree with them and try to apply the same thing to ourselves. If you look at the Middle East project per se, it's about trying to achieve a balance of obligations to non-proliferation in the region. We started it off in 1974 at the UN with the Iranians. That resolution achieved a consensus, including everybody in the region, for years. The UN wrote technical reports about how to move forward on that. We then moved to the regional context within ACRES to try to get direct negotiations. We then, and I say this openly, and if you want to know the details, you can read my book in a month. We then did bilateral negotiations with the Israelis and reached a preliminary agreement on a number of steps to do, but then that failed as well. Then we did the NPT process, which is given our commitment to the NPT, and the assumption we had that everybody at the NPT also supported universal adherence to the treaty. So the proposal to go back to the UN now is, again, simply an attempt to deal with a problem that's of security concern to us. But we shouldn't be fixated here as a group so much on the form, but try to answer the question, how do we deal with the problem that there is an asymmetry in the region? Somebody has a better idea, put it on the table. I would even suggest to you now that the situation is so bad that somebody who's been doing this for over 25 years, and I could never believe myself calling for this now, I would like to see a reaffirmation from the regional states, all of them, that they support the creation of a zone free of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. And I would like to see a reaffirmation from the 5 permanent members of exactly the same commitment, that they support this pursuit. Let them all put this at the Security Council. Why is it, and by the way, I made this suggestion in October 2013. 9 of the 10 have remained silent, and I wonder why. So the idea of this is about the wrong format is completely wrong. You're not taking into account the security concerns of the region. It will create a problem. Besides, your regression from non-proliferation commitments, regional regressions, will also create problems for the regime as a whole in the future.
We have time for...
One last point, though.
Yes, please.
On Bill's point, I completely support any attempt to deal with these issues outside and inside the context, and I can give you examples of efforts like PPNN that's supported between NGOs in the region that develop very decent language on these issues. Thank you.
So we'll collect 3 final questions, and then Shata will also have her final question. Kayhan Barzigar next.
Thank you. My name is Kayhan Barzigar. I'm from Iran. Actually, it's a short comment. I wanted to mention about the Minister FAHMI, a strong point about the imbalance between different principles of the NPT and how much it has weakened the regional position. And this perspective also extends to other regional countries, including Iran. But my point is that this imbalance will lead countries towards individual security system. And if we can bring the case of Iran, for instance, the main Iranian logic for enhancing its missiles activities is for the sense of threats from Israel, and it is based on massive conventional missiles fire. And if I can be a little bit, and if you don't mind, provocative, the only leverage that can force Israel to come back to the table, it's Iranian missiles activity. Therefore, I think it is going to the individual security system at the expense of collective security system, and this will weaken somehow regional position in any NPT kind of provision. Thank you.
Francesca Giovannini next.
Thank you, Francesca Giovannini from CTBTO. I have just 2 questions. The first one is, Ambassador has mentioned that twice a week, the same group of diplomats was coming together to negotiate CTBT. So I'm wondering how much the personal trust and relationship that you all built as diplomats also really greatly helped the process of negotiation. And the second question is, at the same time of the NPT negotiations, the UN was releasing very important documents like the Agenda for Peace or Agenda for Development of Kofi Annan. So there was also a movement towards this idea of peace, global peace, that was really important beyond the NPT. It seems to me today that the NPT is somehow something that is happening almost away from global trends and big discussions on sustainable development, on climate change. So is this link important to be reinstated? You know, the UN Agenda for Peace, I think, is a great opportunity perhaps to reinstate the link that existed in 1995. Thank you.
And the final questions here in the center. Yeah.
Well, I'm Abdurrasoulik Salar from Iran Institute for Middle East Strategic Studies. Actually, from Iranian perspective, the JCPO is very much connected with the NPT. And that's one of the reasons that Minister Zarif in May has said that one of the Iranian moves to the maximum pressure could be the withdrawal from the NPT. So I see it as a kind of a failure for NPT. And what would be the response from, I mean, the 2020, if we are going to a new conference on the NPT, what would be the lesson of such a failure? Because anyway, it shows that the treaty is not working, and the people who are member are changing their idea about the decision. I'm not going through that, how would be the response to the Iranian possible withdrawal, but anyway, regarding the possible review toward the treaty itself to make it more effective, what, I mean, any one of the panelists could answer on that.
I suggest we can discuss, I mean, GCPA will have a special panel, but as part of the 2020 interview conference, I think it could be useful discussion during the next session. During this panel, I would appreciate if each of the panelists, if you wish, will mention what was the Iran role during, if there were any, during 1995 NPT review conference. And I should also mention that a good description of what was Iran's position and what was interagency Iran position is in memoirs of current sitting Iran President Rouhani. He wrote those memoirs during his time as National Security Council Secretary. So now the floor goes to Shata for the very final question from co-chairs, and then we'll give the floor to all four panelists to answer any question they would like to respond. Please.
Yeah, this is just to finish where we started, really, and to ask all the panelists if you would like to offer one major lesson from '95, which could be applied to next year's review conference.
I suggest, Ambassador FAHMI, to start with you.
Well, yes, the one major lesson that I draw that frankly would apply now and apply in the future, diplomacy works if there's a commitment to listen to the other side. Now, I don't mean necessarily agree with the other side, but, and I think there was a question also from the floor about the personal component. Personal relations don't change policy, but they allow for people to get over obstacles when we're listening to each other. So if we want to preserve 2020 and the NPT review conference, we have to listen to each other and work on it. If we don't, we're going to suffer consequences.
Thank you. Ambassador Mason, please answer the final question as well as...
Yeah, well, I more or less jumped ahead and answered the final question in my previous comment about this importance of the bridge building and so on, and I really echo what Nabil FAHMI said as well. I mean, part of the huge difference, it seems to me, from, from the Cold War days, never mind when things improved, but going back to the Cold War, is the failure now to take account, to even try and understand, and this is reflected in the media, where the perceived security concerns of the other side. I mean, even to describe them can lead one to be accused of being an apologist for the other side. So, the European Leadership Network, who kindly facilitated my being here, issued a statement to the UN General Assembly, to the high-level meeting, saying, we need to relearn the lessons and skills of the past. Negotiating is not a reward for good behavior. And it seems to me that it's not I mean, we really have to take much more seriously the importance of listening to the other side and understanding what their position is and why it is, why they have that position. Just on the missile, question and the Iranian sense of threat with good reason, having spent whatever it was, 8 years with Scud missiles raining down on them. And of course, there is no treaty against such missiles. But I do want to say a word about, this discussion about if Iran withdrew from the NPT. I mean, the failure we're facing is the failure of the JCPOA, not because of Iranian noncompliance. And this was an agreement that was enshrined in a UN Security Council resolution, co-sponsored by the P5. So I'm not sure what you can do to insulate an international agreement, from abrogation, any more than was done in the case, and still the United States walked away. So to me, that is the larger concern facing all of us, and that is, just that demonstration of lack of concern about obligations undertaken, I would say, at the highest level. But the only solution there is, and if it can't be done in the formal context, then it certainly should be done in the Track 2 context, to bring together all sides to really, in the first instance, listen, and then try to build these bridges.
Einhorn.
A positive lesson, a major lesson I draw from the '95 experience is that it's possible to have a successful conference outcome without agreeing on a comprehensive final document approved by consensus. In '95, there was an effort to try to reach a document by by consensus. But it was not achievable because many of the same issues that divide us today divided us in '95. Disarmament, different civil nuclear technologies and so forth. It just wasn't possible. But yet the parties were able to come together on a package of decisions that everyone regarded as a very positive outcome. Today, there's no prospect of a consensus final outcome. There's just, the disagreements are just too great. If the review conference did manage to achieve a consensus final outcome, it would be a mind-numbing, lengthy document with watered-down formulations that did not move the process forward. So in my view, it's very important next year to drop the insistence on a consensus final document as the only possible successful outcome, and to have a kind of what I call a variable geometry outcome, a number of separate decisions. Maybe the chapeau is a 2-page reaffirmation at the ministerial level of the importance of sustaining this important agreement. And then there may be a number of ideas that can achieve consensus. Then fine, list those, but don't hold them hostage to the other issues where you can achieve consensus. If there's some important issues like the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, it should get a suitable reference, even if there are those who disagree with that approach. It is possible to concoct an outcome that will be very positive, that people can understand, that reporters can report on, without having, one of these 25-page monstrosities.
Thank you. Ambassador Berdennikov.
Well, I'm afraid of going to platitudes, but to me, much depends on the right analysis of the situation and setting realistic goals. Well, maybe in today's situation, the example of P&O document could be looked at very attentively. I don't know, but just maybe. So be realistic and be bold.
Thank you. I think it was a very good session, though not too much optimism.
And not uplifting. No.
And again, I apologize for the fact that we are not able to collect all questions. We will have more time for discussion during the lunches, receptions, and during next session. Please join me to thank all four panelists and my co-chair. For us, it was a good experience, for us, for CENESS, and for me personally, to have co-chair for the session. We will have a co-chair for the next one, and I'm glad that we already started discussion about 2020 NPT review conference during that session, but even before, Foreign Minister Lavrov and Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov, as well as other speakers during the first opening plenary, refer to that upcoming conference. Now, if we don't have what was expected to be ready by that moment, okay, I think we are ready? Good. There is a good tradition. It's a quite new one at the conference, but there is a good tradition when Canadian delegates celebrate their birthday during the conference. Last time it was Tariq Rauf, and today is what my team told me from open sources. They knew that Cheryl Cruz. Where is Cheryl?
There she is back there.
Cheryl. I mean, according to our information, you have a birthday today.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Cheryl. Very nice.
So now this session is over. We do have a buffet lunch for 1 hour, but please be back to this conference room at 2:30. Thank you.